The room did not change when she said it, but Elias did. His hand tightened slightly against the back of the wooden chair beside him, knuckles whitening just enough to betray that the name had found its mark. Thomas Whitaker had not been spoken inside this house in over a decade. Not by neighbors. Not by Elias himself. The photograph on the mantel seemed heavier now, as if the glass carried more than dust and memory. He did not turn toward her right away. Instead, he walked to the stove and poured himself coffee he did not want, buying seconds he could not afford to lose. "That is not a name folks mention lightly," he said at last, his voice steady but stripped of warmth. Clara lifted her eyes from the fire. She did not look frightened. She looked certain. "I know," she replied. The wind outside pressed against the windows, a low whistle slipping through the cracks in the frame. 12 miles from town, and somehow the past had still managed to find him. Elias finally faced her fully. In the glow of the firelight, he studied her features with new intent. The line of her jaw, the shape of her brow. Something familiar flickered there, subtle as a reflection in water. He had not seen Thomas in 12 years, but blood had a way of repeating itself. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked. Not sharp, not accusing, just direct. Clara set the tin cup down carefully on the small table beside her chair. The metal clicked softly against wood. "I have heard it my whole life," she said. The words hung between them, calm and deliberate. Elias felt the air thin. He crossed the room in 3 slow steps and reached for the photograph on the mantel. He did not hand it to her. He simply held it in both hands and looked at the younger version of himself standing beside his brother under a sky that had not yet tested them. Thomas had no children, Elias said quietly. It was something he had repeated to himself for years. A fact. A closed door. Clara rose from her chair. "Not too close, not too far." "That is what the town believed," she answered. "It is not what my mother told me." The fire cracked behind her, throwing shadows along the walls. Elias felt a memory stir. One he had buried deep under work and silence. A spring afternoon. A girl from the next county. Laughter near the barn. Thomas had never spoken much about her afterward. Elias had not asked. Asking would have meant involvement. And involvement had always cost something. He placed the photograph back on the mantel with care. "Your mother's name," he said. Clara held his gaze. "Margaret Bennett." The name moved through him like a slow current. He remembered it now. Not clearly, but enough. A church picnic. A blue dress. Thomas standing taller than usual, trying to look responsible. Elias had warned him then about promises. About pride. About how the world did not forgive young men easily. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely more than breath. "You were saying Thomas Whitaker was your father." Clara nodded once. "Yes, sir." There was no accusation in her tone. No demand. Just truth laid down plain as a fence post. Elias looked toward the door, toward the dark stretch of prairie beyond it. For 12 years he had believed he was the last Whitaker left standing. Now, inside his own house, the past was not knocking. It was sitting by his fire, waiting. Silence settled between them. Thick but not hostile, the kind of silence that demanded patience rather than fear. Elias moved back to the table and pulled out the chair opposite her, lowering himself into it slowly as though the weight of the last few minutes had added years to his frame. He studied Clara with a careful eye now, not searching for deceit, but for resemblance. In the slope of her nose, he could see Thomas at 20. In the steadiness of her posture, he saw something that might have come from her mother. "How old are you?" he asked quietly. 28, she replied without hesitation. The number fit too neatly into the empty spaces of his memory. 28 years ago had been the last summer the ranch had felt light, before pride and stubbornness and small-town talk began to press in from all sides. He remembered arguments about land boundaries, about business deals that never felt quite fair. He remembered Thomas insisting he would handle things his own way. What he did not remember was ever hearing about a child. Elias leaned back in his chair, wood creaking under the shift. "Your mother never came to me," he said. It was not an accusation. It was confusion. Clara folded her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced tightly, as though holding something fragile in place. "She said she tried," she answered. "She said she wrote a letter after my father left town. She never received a reply." Elias felt a slow heat rise behind his ribs, not anger at her, but at the possibility that something meant for him had never reached his hands. The ranch house had always been remote, but the mail route passed within 5 miles. A letter should have found its way. He stood abruptly and walked to a small wooden box near the bookshelf, the one place he kept documents from years past. He knelt, lifted the lid, and began sorting through folded papers tied with twine. Deeds, receipts, old notices from the bank. He searched with deliberate care, as if the answer might be tucked between faded ink and brittle edges. Clara remained by the fire, watching without interrupting. The flames reflected in her eyes, steady and patient. After several long moments, Elias closed the box and sat back on his heels. There was no letter, he said quietly. He believed it. He would have remembered. He had replayed those final months with Thomas too many times not to recall something that important. Clara inhaled slowly. My mother kept a copy, she said. She made me read it when I was 16. She said if anything ever happened to her, I was to find you. Elias looked up sharply. Is she gone? The question came softer than he intended. Clara nodded once. 2 winters ago. Fever. The word was simple, final, familiar to anyone who had lived long enough on the frontier. Elias lowered his gaze to the floorboards. 28 years of absence suddenly rearranged themselves into something less like abandonment and more like separation shaped by silence. He rose and returned to the table, stopping a few feet from her. Why come now, he asked. Clara met his eyes without wavering. Because before she died, she told me something else. She said my father never blamed you for how things ended. She said he carried regret, not anger. The fire cracked behind her, and Elias felt the edges of a story he had told himself for 12 years begin to shift. The words lingered in the room long after. Clara finished speaking, as if they needed time to settle into the cracks of the old ranch house. Elias did not answer her right away. He walked to the window instead and looked out across the dark stretch of prairie, where the moonlight brushed the tops of the grass in pale silver. For 12 years he had carried a single version of the past, one where distance had grown into resentment and silence had hardened into certainty. Now that certainty felt thinner, like frost under the first light of morning. Regret. He repeated quietly, tasting the word as if unsure it belonged to his brother. Thomas had always been quick to smile, quick to trust, sometimes too quick to believe things would mend themselves. Elias had been the cautious one, the careful one, the one who stayed when others left. He rested his palm against the cool glass of the window and let his gaze drift toward the old fence line half a mile out, where the property had once been disputed and pride had done more damage than weather ever could. Your mother, he said after a moment, still facing the dark. What did she tell you about those days? Clara rose slowly and stepped closer, though she kept a respectful distance. She said there was a disagreement about land and money, she answered. She said people in town chose sides before they knew the whole story. She said my father believed you were trying to protect him, even if it did not look that way at the time. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Protect him. That had been the intention, though he had never found the right words to explain it. He had urged Thomas to step back from a risky agreement, to let the dust settle before signing anything binding. But Thomas had seen caution as doubt, and doubt as betrayal. By the time pride cooled, both men had already walked separate roads. Elias turned back toward Clara, the firelight catching the lines etched deeper into his face than they had any right to be. Your father left before I could make things right, he said. I thought he chose distance over family. Clara shook her head gently. He thought you chose control over trust. The honesty in her tone did not sting. It steadied. Elias nodded once, accepting the symmetry of it. 2 brothers standing on opposite ends of the same misunderstanding, each believing the other had stepped away first. The fire burned lower, casting a softer glow across the room. Clara reached into the pocket of her coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, edges worn from years of careful keeping. She did not unfold it yet. She simply held it between both hands. This is the copy my mother saved, she said quietly. The letter she wrote to you. Elias looked at the paper as though it might vanish if he blinked. A simple sheet, nothing remarkable, and yet it carried the weight of nearly 3 decades. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he met Clara's eyes again and saw not accusation, not expectation, but something steadier. Hope, perhaps. Outside, the wind eased, and for the first time that night, the ranch house felt less like a refuge from the past, and more like a place where it might finally be understood. The paper trembled only slightly in Clara's hands, but Elias noticed. Not fear, Not doubt, just the weight of carrying something for too many years. He stepped forward at last and took the folded letter from her, careful not to brush her fingers, as though the space between them still required respect. The page felt thin, worn soft at the creases from being opened and closed more times than he could count without even knowing it existed. He walked back to the table and sat down slowly, the chair scraping faintly against the wooden floor. The fire behind him had settled into a steady glow, casting long shadows that moved gently along the walls. He unfolded the paper with deliberate hands. The handwriting was neat, slanted slightly to the right. Margaret Bennett. He remembered that steadiness in her voice years ago. He began to read in silence. The words were simple. No accusations. No demands. She wrote that Thomas had left town with regret heavy on his shoulders, that pride had clouded both brothers, that a child had been born with his eyes and his stubborn chin. She wrote that she did not want money. She did not want land. She wanted only for family to know family. Elias paused, his gaze lingering on that line. Family to know family. He swallowed once, the motion visible in the quiet room. The letter spoke of long winters, of Clara learning to walk beside a small creek near their home, of Thomas working hard and speaking often of the ranch he once shared with his brother. Not with bitterness, with longing. Elias felt something shift inside him, not sharp, not sudden, but steady as thawing ground in early spring. He had believed silence meant blame. He had believed distance meant rejection. But here, in ink faded slightly with time, was evidence of something gentler. A misunderstanding allowed to grow because neither side had found the courage to cross it. He lowered the letter and looked up at Clara. She stood straight, hands clasped before her, waiting not for approval but for truth. He talked about this place, she said softly. He described the pasture at sunrise. The way the grass turns gold for about 10 minutes before the light climbs higher. He said you used to stand by the fence with a cup of coffee and pretend you were not proud of what you built. Elias almost smiled at that. Almost. He folded the letter carefully along its old lines and set it on the table between them. It did not feel like evidence. It felt like a bridge laid down after years of open ground. I never received this, he said quietly. But I should have gone looking sooner. I should have asked more questions before letting silence settle in. The admission did not sound like confession. It sounded like understanding. Clara nodded once. My mother said sometimes men think strength means standing still, she replied. She said sometimes it means walking back. The fire cracked softly, and outside the wind had faded to almost nothing. Elias reached for the letter again, not to read it this time, but to hold it with intention. For the first time in 12 years, the past no longer felt like a closed door. It felt like something that could be stepped through, slowly, without fear. The letter remained on the table between them like a quiet witness, its edges catching the firelight as though it carried its own small flame. Elias did not speak for a long moment. He rose from his chair and walked toward the far corner of the room where a narrow staircase led to the loft above. Each step creaked under his weight, slow and deliberate, as if he were climbing into years he had avoided. Clara stayed where she was, her eyes following him but her posture calm. She did not press him with questions. She understood that some doors, once opened, required a man to step through alone. In the loft, Elias knelt beside an old cedar chest pushed beneath the slanted roof. Dust rested thick along its lid. He brushed it aside with his palm and lifted the latch. Inside were folded blankets, a spare coat, and beneath them, a small wooden box no larger than a Bible. He hesitated before opening it, not from fear, but from the weight of what it represented. 12 years earlier, after Thomas had left town and word came back of his passing far from home, Elias had gathered the few things returned to him. He had told himself he was preserving them. In truth, he had been guarding his own regret. He carried the small box downstairs and set it on the table beside the letter. Clara watched closely now, her breathing shallow but steady. Elias opened the lid and lifted out a silver pocket watch, its surface worn smooth from years of use. The chain was slightly bent near the clasp. He held it in his palm for a moment before speaking. This belonged to your father, he said quietly. Our father gave it to him when he turned 21. Said a man ought to know the value of time. He flipped the cover open. The ticking had stopped long ago, but the engraved initials inside were still clear. T.W. Clara stepped closer, her gaze softening at the sight. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Elias closed the watch and rested it beside the letter. I kept this because I thought it was all that remained, he continued. I believed there was nothing else. His voice did not crack. It steadied. Clara drew a slow breath. There is more, she said gently. There is me. The words were simple, but they carried no demand, only fact. Elias looked at her fully then, seeing not a stranger seeking claim, but a living continuation of a brother he had lost twice, once to distance and once to death. The fire burned low, casting a softer glow across the room. Outside, the prairie lay quiet under a wide night sky, stretching miles in every direction. Elias picked up the watch and held it out to her. His hand did not tremble. Time stopped for me 12 years ago, he said. It does not have to stay that way. Clara accepted the watch carefully, her fingers closing around it as though holding something fragile and sacred at once. The room felt different now, not lighter exactly, but more honest. The past had not disappeared. It had simply shifted, making space for something that had been missing all along. Clara held the pocket watch in both hands, turning it slightly so the firelight traced the worn silver edges, her thumb brushing over the engraved initials as if confirming they were real. Elias watched her without speaking, noticing how naturally the watch rested in her palm, as though it had been waiting all these years to return to blood. The house had grown quieter, the wind nearly gone, the boards no longer shifting with complaint. It felt less like a shelter now and more like a place standing still, listening. Clara lifted her gaze from the watch and looked toward the mantel again, toward the photograph of two young men who had once believed time would always move forward without consequence. He used to wind it every night, she said softly. My mother told me he would sit by the lamp and hold it close to his ear, just to hear it tick. Elias felt the memory settle into him, not sharp, not painful, but tender in a way he had not allowed himself to feel. He said it reminded him that no matter how far a man rides, he still answers to the same hours, Clara continued. Elias gave a faint nod. That sounds like him, he said quietly. He walked to the small shelf near the stove and poured fresh coffee into 2 cups this time, not because either of them needed it, but because the act of sharing something ordinary felt right. He handed one to her without hesitation. Their fingers brushed briefly, not by accident, but without discomfort. Clara accepted the cup and sat back down near the fire. The pocket watch rested on the table between them now, no longer hidden in a box, no longer tied to silence. Elias took a slow breath and leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. If you are his daughter, he said, not questioning but acknowledging, then this land is not just mine. The words were measured, careful, as though he were laying down something heavy and choosing not to pick it back up. Clara's eyes widened slightly, not with greed, but with surprise. I did not come for land, she said gently. I came because I did not want his name to end in a story that was never corrected. Elias looked at her for a long moment, seeing the steadiness in her posture, the absence of demand in her tone. The town had whispered for years about stubborn brothers and broken trust. He had let those whispers settle into fact. Now, sitting across from Thomas's daughter, he felt the quiet truth rising instead. Names matter out here, he said. Reputation lasts longer than fences. Clara nodded. Then let it last honestly. The fire dipped lower, embers glowing red beneath ash. Elias rose and placed another log carefully onto the flames, watching as it caught and burned slow and steady. He understood something now that he had missed before. Strength had never been about holding ground alone. It had been about knowing when to open it. He turned back toward her, the lines in his face softened by more than firelight. You will stay the night, he said. It was not a question. It was an offering. Clara gave a small, grateful nod. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and patient under the stars, and for the first time in many years, the ranch did not feel like a place defined by what had been lost, but by what had quietly returned. Morning arrived slowly over the prairie, not with noise, but with light stretching thin and pale across the horizon, turning the grass beyond the fence into a quiet sea of gold. Elias was already awake when the first line of sun touched the window. Habit had trained him that way. Years of tending cattle and mending fence before the heat rose above 80 degrees had set his body to the rhythm of land rather than clocks. He stepped onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee in hand, the air cool enough to carry the scent of dew and dry earth together. For a moment, he stood still, listening to the low rustle of wind moving through the pasture and the distant shift of a horse in the small barn 50 yards from the house. Behind him, the door opened softly. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her coat folded neatly over her arm now, her posture less guarded than the night before. She paused beside him, leaving a respectful foot of space, and followed his gaze toward the horizon. He described this, she said quietly. Said the light out here never rushes. Elias nodded once. It does not, he replied. It takes its time. Teaches a man to do the same. They stood together in silence, not uncomfortable, not searching for words to fill it. The pocket watch rested inside Clara's coat pocket, a weight neither heavy nor light, just present. Elias took a slow sip of coffee and then set the cup down on the porch railing. Come, he said after a moment. There is something you should see. He stepped down from the porch and walked across the yard, boots pressing into the packed dirt path that led toward the far pasture. Clara followed, matching his pace. The grass brushed lightly against their legs as they moved past the fence line, the morning sun rising higher, warming the air by degrees. About a quarter-mile out, near an old cottonwood tree that leaned slightly to the east, Elias slowed. The tree had stood there longer than the ranch house, older than both brothers who once worked beneath it. At its base rested a simple wooden marker, weathered by seasons, but still upright. Clara stopped when she saw it. Elias removed his hat, holding it against his chest. He was brought back here, he said quietly. Not by town folk. By me. His voice did not carry pride. It carried responsibility. I could not fix what happened between us, but I could make sure he rested on family land. Clara stepped closer to the marker, reading the carved name with steady eyes. Thomas Whitaker. The letters had softened with time, but they remained clear. She did not kneel. She did not cry. She simply stood, breathing in the same air that had once filled her father's lungs when he was young and certain. Elias placed his hat back on his head and looked toward the horizon again. I thought bringing him home was enough, he said, but I see now it was only part of it. Clara slipped her hand into her pocket and felt the curve of the watch beneath her fingers. You finished what you could, she replied gently. The rest was waiting. The sun climbed higher, washing the pasture in full light. In that quiet stretch of land, under the wide American sky, past and present no longer stood apart. They stood side by side, steady as the cottonwood tree, rooted in the same ground at last. Clara remained by the wooden marker a while longer, her eyes tracing the carved letters as though committing them to memory, while Elias stepped a few paces back, giving her space that felt earned rather than granted. The morning had fully opened now, sunlight stretching wide across the pasture, warming the damp grass and carrying the faint scent of earth and cottonwood bark. A meadowlark called from somewhere beyond the fence line, its clear note cutting through the stillness in a way that felt almost deliberate. Elias watched Clara carefully, not to measure her reaction, but to understand it. She did not bow her head in grief. She stood upright, shoulders steady, as though meeting someone she had known all her life but never touched. After a moment, she slipped the pocket watch from her coat and held it loosely at her side. He would have liked this, she said softly, her gaze still on the marker. He always said a man should end where he began. Elias considered that. He began here, he replied. But he did not stay. Clara turned toward him then, her expression thoughtful rather than questioning. Neither did you, she said. The words were not sharp. They were simple truth. Elias let out a slow breath, watching it fade into the warming air. I stayed on the land, he answered, but not in the world. For years he had kept to the ranch, avoiding town unless supplies demanded it, keeping conversations short and eyes forward. He had believed solitude was strength. Now, standing beneath the wide sky with his brother's daughter beside him, that belief felt incomplete. Clara stepped closer to the cottonwood tree and gently touched its rough bark. My mother told me you were not the kind of man who spoke much, she said. But she said you listened. Elias gave a faint nod. Listening is easier than explaining, he said. Clara looked back toward the house in the distance, a modest shape against miles of open ground. What happens now? She asked, not with urgency, but with quiet curiosity. Elias followed her gaze. The ranch had been his alone for so long that he had stopped imagining it any other way. The barn roof needed patching before winter. The north fence sagged near the creek. There was work to be done, as there always was. But work no longer felt like something to hide behind. He turned back toward the marker once more, tipping his hat slightly, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. Now, he said slowly, we make sure the story is told right. Clara closed the watch and slipped it back into her pocket. Together? She asked. Elias met her eyes, seeing not a stranger, not an obligation, but family standing firm in morning light. Together, he replied. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, bending it in one direction before letting it rise again. Under the open sky, beside a tree that had witnessed more seasons than either of them, the past no longer stood as a wall between two lives. It stood as common ground, steady and shared. They walked back toward the house at an unhurried pace, the grass brushing against their boots, the sun climbing higher with each step, as if marking the beginning of something neither of them had planned but both understood. The ranch no longer felt isolated against the miles of open prairie. It felt anchored. When they reached the porch, Elias paused and rested his hand on the wooden railing worn smooth by years of use. He looked at the yard, at the barn sitting 50 yards to the east, at the split-rail fence stretching nearly half a mile before dipping toward the creek. For years he had maintained every inch of it alone, not because he had to, but because he had believed it was his burden to carry. Clara stepped beside him and followed his gaze. It is beautiful, she said quietly. Elias nodded once. It is work, he replied, though there was less hardness in his tone than before. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. Inside, the house carried the warmth of morning light now streaming through the windows, illuminating the photograph on the mantel and the table where the letter still rested. Elias walked to the table and picked it up, smoothing the folds carefully. If we are to make things right, he said, the town should hear the truth. Clara's expression shifted slightly, a trace of concern crossing her features. Some of them chose sides, she said. My mother told me. Elias gave a slow nod. They did, and I let them. He placed the letter into the inner pocket of his vest, close to his chest. But stories change when men stand up and speak plain. He moved toward the small wash basin near the back wall and poured fresh water into it, splashing his face and running a hand through his hair as though preparing for something larger than a simple visit to town. Clara watched him with quiet attention. You do not owe anyone an explanation, she said softly. Elias dried his face with a clean cloth and met her eyes in the reflection of the small mirror above the basin. Perhaps not, he answered. But your father does. The words settled in the room with calm certainty. Clara reached into her coat pocket and removed the pocket watch once more, placing it gently on the table beside the photograph. Then let his name be spoken with both of yours, she said. Elias stepped closer and looked down at the watch, then at the image of two young men who once believed pride was the same as strength. I carried silence like it was loyalty, he said quietly. It was not. He straightened his shoulders, not with defiance, but with resolve. Outside, the horses shifted in the barn, ready for harness. The road to town stretched 12 miles across open land, a path Elias had traveled countless times for supplies, but rarely for anything personal. Today would be different. He moved toward the door, pausing only long enough to pick up his hat from its hook. Clara stood beside him, steady and unafraid. When he opened the door, the sunlight fell across the threshold, bright and clear. Together, they stepped out onto the porch, not as strangers bound by coincidence, but as family choosing to walk the same road forward. The road to town stretched long and pale beneath the late morning sun, a narrow ribbon of packed dirt cutting through miles of open prairie. Elias guided the wagon at a steady pace, the horses moving with calm familiarity, their harnesses creaking softly with each step. Clara sat beside him on the wooden bench, her hands resting in her lap, the pocket watch tucked safely inside her coat. Neither of them rushed. The silence. The land around them rolled wide and patient, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional fence line marking distant claims. 12 miles was not far by necessity, but it was far enough for a man to reconsider his choices. Elias did not reconsider. He kept his eyes forward, jaw set not in anger, but in resolve. As the outline of town came into view, low wooden buildings gathered along a single main street, dust drifting lightly between them, Clara drew a slow breath. A few townsfolk moved along the boardwalks, hats tipped against the sun, conversations pausing as the wagon approached. Elias had not arrived with company in years. That alone drew attention. He brought the horses to a gentle stop near the general store, stepping down first before offering his hand to Clara. She accepted it without hesitation. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Eyes followed them as they crossed toward the center of the street. Elias removed his hat, not as surrender, but as respect for the moment. Old Mr. Harper stood near the post office, leaning on his cane, his gaze sharp despite his age. A pair of ranch hands paused mid-conversation by the water trough. Whispers began to gather, soft but curious. Elias did not wait for them to swell. He stepped forward into the open stretch of dirt between the buildings and spoke in a voice that carried steady across the quiet street. "Some of you remember my brother Thomas Whitaker," he began. The name hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Faces shifted. Some lowered their eyes. Some held his gaze. Clara stood beside him, posture straight, expression calm. Elias reached into his vest and removed the folded letter, holding it where it could be seen but not yet read. "Years ago, there were disagreements," he continued. "Pride took hold where patience should have. He did not accuse. He did not defend. He simply spoke plain. I believed silence was strength. I was wrong." The admission settled heavier than any raised voice could have. He unfolded the letter and read Margaret Bennett's words aloud, steady and clear, letting each line carry its own weight. He spoke of regret, of family, of a child who had grown without knowing her uncle. When he finished, the street remained still. No one interrupted. No one laughed. Clara stepped forward then, drawing the pocket watch from her coat and holding it in both hands. The silver caught the sun. "My father never carried anger," she said quietly, her voice strong despite its softness. "He carried hope." Elias looked at the faces around him, men and women who had once chosen sides based on half-truths and hurried judgment. "Let his name stand honest," he said. There was no demand in it, only certainty. The wind moved gently down the street, lifting a thin swirl of dust before settling again. In that silence, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. The silence did not break with applause or protest. It held, steady and thick, as though the town itself needed a moment to remember something it had once known but allowed to fade. Mr. Harper was the first to move. The old man shifted his cane in the dust and stepped forward 2 slow paces, his eyes fixed on Elias. "Thomas was a good worker," he said, voice rough with age. "Never missed a sunrise when cattle needed tending." It was not an apology. It was acknowledgement. Elias inclined his head slightly, accepting it without triumph. A woman near the bakery door pressed her hand to her chest, her gaze settling on Clara. "Your mother used to buy flour here every Saturday," she said softly. "Always spoke kindly of this town." Clara met her eyes and gave a small nod. "She never wished it ill," she replied. The words carried no bitterness, only truth. One by one, the rigid lines and shoulders began to ease. A ranch hand who had once stood firmly on the opposite side of the old dispute removed his hat and held it against his chest. "We were quick to choose," he said quietly, slower to listen. Elias did not step closer. He did not claim vindication. He simply stood where he was, the letter now folded again in his hand. "We were all younger," he answered. Pride speaks loud when men do not. The statement did not single anyone out. It included himself. Clara took a single step forward, the pocket watch glinting in her palm. "My father carried this until the day he passed," she said. "He told me time does not stop for mistakes, but it does allow for correction." She extended the watch slightly, not offering it away, but showing it plainly. The sunlight caught the engraved initials once more, bright against worn silver. A quiet murmur moved through the gathered crowd, not of gossip, but of recognition. Years earlier, they had witnessed 2 brothers drift apart under half-understood circumstances. Now they were witnessing something steadier. Elias placed the folded letter into Mr. Harper's hands. "Keep it in the records," he said. "Let it sit with the rest of our history." Mr. Harper nodded slowly, accepting the responsibility as if it weighed more than paper. The wind stirred down the street again, lifting a faint swirl of dust before settling against the boardwalk. No one shouted. No one demanded more. There was no spectacle in reconciliation, Only a quiet shift in how a name would be spoken from that day forward. Elias turned slightly toward Clara, his posture no longer guarded but open. "That is enough," he said quietly. She looked around the street one last time, not searching for approval, but seeing understanding settle in small gestures and softened expressions. Together, they walked back toward the wagon, boots pressing steady prints into the same dirt that had once carried whispers. Behind them, the town remained still, not in judgment, but in thought. And in that stillness, a story that had once divided began, at last, to rest in truth. The wagon rolled out of town without ceremony, wheels turning slow over the packed dirt as the murmurs behind them faded into ordinary afternoon sounds. Elias did not look back this time. He did not need to. The road home stretched 12 miles across open prairie, sunlight settling warmer now against the wide land. Clara sat beside him, the brim of her hat casting a soft shadow across her face, the pocket watch resting secure in her coat. For a while, neither of them spoke. The horses moved steady, their rhythm even, as though the day were no different from any other. But it was. Something unseen had shifted, not in the sky or the grass, but in the weight Elias carried inside his chest. The ranch came into view by late afternoon, the barn standing firm against the horizon, the fence line catching light in quiet lines of silver. Elias guided the wagon into the yard and brought the horses to a halt. He stepped down and began unhitching them with practiced hands, movements familiar, grounded. Clara moved to help without being asked, steadying the harness as he loosened the straps. There was no awkwardness in the shared work, only rhythm. When the horses were led into the barn, Elias lingered a moment, running his hand along the wooden stall door, feeling the grain beneath his palm. "This place has been quiet a long time," he said, not looking at her. Clara rested her hand lightly against the barn post. "Quiet does not have to mean empty," she answered. He glanced at her then, the faintest hint of a smile touching his expression. As evening approached, they walked once more toward the cottonwood tree at the far pasture. The sky had begun its slow change again, blue deepening toward amber near the horizon. The wooden marker stood steady where they had left it that morning. Elias removed his hat, holding it against his chest, not out of habit now, but out of peace. Clara stepped beside him and withdrew the pocket watch, opening it gently. The hands no longer moved, frozen at an hour long past. She looked at it for a moment, then closed the lid and placed it carefully at the base of the marker. Elias watched her, surprised. "It belongs here," she said softly. "Time carried him away once. It does not need to carry him anymore." Elias nodded slowly. He did not argue. Together they stood beneath the cottonwood as the last lights spread gold across the pasture, touching the grass, the fence, the ranch house in the distance. The wind rose just enough to stir the leaves above them, a quiet sound like breath moving through memory. Elias felt no urge to speak further. There was nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove. The land remained. Family remained. The rest had been pride and silence, and both had been set down. As the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft bands of fading light, Elias placed his hat back on his head and turned toward the house. Clara walked beside him, her steps matching his without effort. Behind them, beneath the steady branches of the cottonwood, a name once divided now rested whole, carried not by rumor, but by truth. And out on the open prairie, where wind and time move without hurry, justice did not arrive with noise. It arrived with understanding, and it stayed.